So I've great pleasure in launching this book today, and in collaboration with the Pat Finucane Centre. And there's a number of speakers, but my job is just to hand over to Paul O'Connor of the PFC, who'll handle this afternoon's events. So I hope you enjoy the launch. It's received massive media coverage, although I myself would be fairly critical of the coverage in the British media. If you consider 120 innocent civilians had been killed by the London Metropolitan Police and with the Territorial Army in London, surely they would be, if this was uncovered, you would expect them to publicise it. And yet BBC UK, Sky News have completely ignored this story. And even yesterday, the Guardian newspaper did not publish a feature by Henry MacDonald on this book. So that's the type of battle and that type of ignorance that we have faced for 30, 40 years, which has made the struggle for these families even more difficult. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Paul O'Connor.
Thank you, Danny, and thanks to St Mary's College. The chair of the PFC, Robin Percival, is going to speak next, and he'll be thanking a number of people. I'm also conscious of the fact that we're joined today by a number of the families who are affected by this book, families that have travelled up from Armagh, Tyrone, from Dublin, from Louth, from elsewhere, Monaghan, and so on. They're obviously particularly welcome. There's other people in the room that I recognise, that I know that we've worked with and that are here, other families from Belfast, families from Derry and elsewhere that we've tried to do advocacy with, we've tried to support, and I'm sure there's many others. Clara's here from Relatives for Justice, and I'm sure there's other families that have been working with RFJ are here as well, and we deeply appreciate that. Appreciate the fact that the Finucane family are here today, and many, many others. I think that the list could go on. Maybe on a very curious note, there's one person I think I would personally thank for being here today, or at least say that he played a role, somewhat of a minor piece in this whole work that's gone on over the last 15 years, and that would be David Trimble, strangely enough. Years ago, I heard David Trimble on the radio questioning the evidence about whether or not the McMahon family in Belfast were actually murdered by members of the RUC back in the 1920s, and said there was no firm evidence that members of the RUC were ever actually involved in those murders. I remember saying to myself, you know, if there's one legacy that we must leave to future generations, it's that people like David Trimble are not able to come along and say, well, there's no firm evidence, and I think the book certainly does that. I'm not up here today to speak, you'll be glad to know. What my job is to basically move the events on, and I want to introduce the chair of the Pat Finucane Centre, Robin Percival from Derry. Thank you.
I just want to say one thing and then shut up, and that is this. You know, this isn't just about the past. I know we talk a lot at the moment about dealing with the past, and people have all kinds of views about how we should deal with it. One view is that we shouldn't deal with it, that we should forget about it, that we should all move on. But one of the central convictions that drives the Pat Finucane Centre is that this is actually about the future, because you cannot have a situation, in my view, and I'm sure in most people, if not everybody's view here, you cannot have a situation where you can just forget about the state being complicit in the killing of its own citizens. Because if we want to move forward as a society, we have to, it seems to me, have some shared understanding of what human rights are and what justice is. And one of the things that human rights isn't, and what justice isn't, is the state colluding in the killing of its own citizens. So this is very much about the future.
Right, the next speaker is Alan Brecknell, who, you know, goes on to the title of our caseworker in the Armagh office, along with Anne. It will become obvious when you read the book that this book wouldn't have happened had it not been for Alan Brecknell. Alan, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I've been asked really to sort of outline where this project from within the Pat Finucane Centre originated. I suppose there's a couple of key points along the way. One of the earlier points, or key points, is my 3.5-year-old son, who is now 17 and standing down the back there, asked me one afternoon why he didn't have a grandfather. And obviously you're not going to traumatise a 3.5-year-old, but all I said to him was that bad men had killed him. But it started me also thinking, you know, why? What actually did happen that night on the 19th of December 1975? We'd gone on, we'd lived our lives. I'd gone to England, gone to university, done a quantity surveying degree, had sort of moved on, I suppose, to a large degree. But it was a question that it kept coming back to me. And in around about the same time, there was an article published in one of the London papers with an ex-RUC officer, John Weir, and he alleged at that time that himself and a number of other RUC officers were involved with loyalist paramilitaries and members of the UDR in a whole series of killings across what would have been known, or Mid-Ulster, probably what would have been better known as the Murder Triangle at the time. I used the word alleged there. I don't think there is any doubt now that it is more than alleged, that it was fact, and that's what this book actually does. I suppose it puts it out there as fact now, no matter what some of our other politicians have tried to say over this last few days. I suppose the big step along the way was we had brought all the families, all the people who were in the bar that night in Silverbridge together and taken statements from them with the help of our own board and Relatives for Justice and a number of other NGOs. And it became evident out of that there hadn't been really a police investigation as such. But one other thing that did come out of it was that the man who owned the bar, Jerry Donnelly, had said that the investigating officer had been quite sympathetic and had met him on a number of occasions, but never in the police station in Newry where he was based. He always wanted to meet elsewhere. He said that he had to watch his back as well as his front. And my mother had also said that she felt he was a very genuine man. So then we put out an appeal in the Belfast Telegraph, not naming him, but asking would he come forward. And he did, and we met him in the Europa Hotel in Belfast. And his opening comment was, as far as he was concerned, as the investigating officer into the attack on Donnelly's bar and a number of others in the South Armagh area at the time, as far as he was concerned, that there was collusion between RUC officers, UDR personnel and loyalists from Portadown. And you can imagine that he was still serving in the RUC at that time. He was a chief superintendent. He was based in RUC headquarters at Knock. It was a huge shock to everyone that was there that day to have a serving RUC officer admit this to the families. I suppose then the other big statement that he made at that time was that permutations of the same gang were also involved in other killings in the area. And he mentioned firstly the Dublin and Monaghan bombings. He also mentioned the murders of Sean Farmer and Colin McCartney in South Armagh, and the Reevy and O'Dowd families.
One wee interesting footnote on the Rock Bar attack that we were talking about that was completely carried out by the Special Patrol Group. One of the attackers actually got back to Keady Station to be on the desk to take the incoming calls and respond to the attack as a police sergeant. He got back in time because he had his police uniform on underneath the overalls that he used in the gun and bomb attack. And as Brian said, 3 of the police officers involved got suspended sentences from the Lord Chief Justice. Our final speaker today, and I think just before I introduce our final speaker, I'm conscious of one thing between all of us from the centre that are speaking, that there is a very large thank you owed to Mercier Press, who took a gamble with us, with Anne, and said, let's publish this book. Let's see if we can, if this can be a runner. And I know Mary is here from Mercier Press. She's travelled the whole way up from Cork today. So Mary, thank you very much, and thank you to Mercier. About, I think it's 3 years ago, I'm not exactly sure anymore, 2-3 years ago, we advertised for a new caseworker in the Armagh office. And when the applications came in, we opened them up. It was all above board. There was no banknotes in the applications, nothing. But there was one application from an Anne Cadwallader, and I said, "That's Anne. I know Anne. I've known Anne for years. She's a journalist." And I thought, what in the name of God would encourage Anne to give up a career in journalism and come join us? There must be some mistake here. But she did want to come and be a caseworker. She was actually the best applicant, and we're standing here today. Anne Cadwallader, would you come forward, please?
Wow. First of all, an appeal to understand that what I've done is merely catalogue other people's work. Writing is a craft. I worked at it for over 30 years. If I can't get it right now, it would be an awful shame. A lot of people this week have said how calm I seem. Please understand, this self-imposed calmness hides the fact that I'm just a whisker away from hysteria. The Pat Finucane Centre's staff and volunteers have done everything they could in terms of open sources, that is, newspaper libraries, archives, eyewitness statements. They'd done everything they could, and then they were helped when the Barron inquiry was started down in Dublin, and he got access to some of the RUC files in as much as he produced appendices of ballistic and forensic evidence linking perpetrators with different attacks. So we had some facts then, but it really was a step change when the HET became involved. The Pat Finucane Centre decided that with all its flaws and imperfections, there was no other process by which families could get the truth. So they decided to engage critically with the HET, and we were lucky enough to get a small team of very diligent officers of huge integrity and courage who went and looked in the files and reported. And report after report after report came out with evidence of collusion in it, and the families got the reports. And the HET said that they would be producing an overarching thematic summary of what they discovered. But for one reason or another, we think it's possible they came under political pressure not to do so. And we were always going to produce our own report anyhow, because the PFC knew that we'd be able to go further than the HET would, which is a statutory body of former police officers and are pretty limited in what they can say. And we, of course, are a human rights organisation, and we can say what we want. So we'd always intended to write a report. But when the HET report never materialised, my work became even more important. So that's how it happened. So far, nearly everything is going well. Channel 4's report by Alex Thompson was excellent, and Irish papers, particularly the Irish Times and even The Independent, have covered the book, as has RTE. Tomorrow there's a discussion on Sunday Secrets on BBC Radio Ulster. The only disappointment is that more British papers haven't given it some prominence, with the notable exception of the London Independent. One supposedly British liberal newspaper that used to pride itself on its coverage of Irish news chose to run the extracts to which they had privileged access on their website only, while coverage on the main radio and television networks has been patchy. One can just imagine the fuss if they discovered that 120 people in London had been killed by the Metropolitan Police and the British Army, but I suppose it shows how foreign a land they believe this truly is.
I mean, I don't know how many people were here today. It was 500 plus. We're nearly sold out of the first print run, and the publication was only 24 hours ago. We're going to have to order more books from Dublin. I mean, people are hungry for the truth. Not speculation or propaganda or assumption, but for hard facts. People are hungry for that. They want to understand what went on here during the conflict. Because the narrative that we've all got is it was Protestant against Catholic. And I think this is beginning to show people that both parts of the community were being manipulated from outside by authorities and powers in London and Stormont that we didn't know anything about at the time.
We made a very big and possibly over-trustful decision to brief the Secretary of State, Theresa Villiers, 2 weeks ago, alerting her that we had significant new information, but she was too busy to meet us. For a while, the small team with whom we worked lifted a tiny corner of the carpet. Although the HET was always a flawed and deeply imperfect truth recovery mechanism and must now be replaced with a truly independent body, it's up to all of us now to ensure that the small corner of the carpet is not nailed back down again. We now know what's possible. We now know what's in the RUC files in Carrickfergus, if only we can get access to them.
Well, what's interesting about today's book is that it concerns cross-border attacks. Dublin and Monaghan, there was people here today who lost loved ones in the Dublin 72 bombings, Castleblaney, Dundalk, and of course, and many, many attacks here north of the border. There was also representatives of the Irish government here today in the second row, which I was glad to see, and our political classes. And there can be no doubt that one of the things that the book shows is that the response of the Irish government in the 1970s, particularly in the border region in response of these activities, was pitiful. There was only one enemy for the Irish and British governments, and that was the IRA. From the perspective of the British government, loyalists were not an enemy at all. They were allies, which is the title of the book, of course, Lethal Allies. And I think the time has come to say, you know what, it is actually healthy, it's right, it's good. Lift the carpet on these affairs. Let's shine a light in the dark places.
And above all, thanks to Alan Brecknell, whose book this truly is, but who constantly insists on standing in the wings. His example shows that individuals can make a difference, can influence history. I also want to say that despite the long queues here and the sellouts in Belfast bookshops, PF staffers, including myself, stand to make no profit from this publication. All profits will be ploughed back into our work, which is inadequately funded. Our current funding runs out within a year. It's difficult for us to take any real pleasure in the initially good sales because we're all in the PFC remembering Maureen McGleenan never leaving home for 8 years, and visiting her son's grave for 30 years until she became too infirm. Could someone get me some water? Brian Donnelly, lying in his recliner for decades, never being able to work again, getting £1,000 in compensation on morphine patches, in constant pain from being shot in the back by a police officer. The 9 wee Malloy children spending hours in a shed at the back of their cottage, peeling apples in the dark and the cold and wet just to support themselves. Marion Bowen's mother, who lost 3 children in the Killylis bombing and an unborn grandchild, and who never recovered from the shock. The HET believes a UDR man was involved. Patsy McNeese's mother, who shrank to 5 stone after witnessing her husband's murder and then died early, leaving her children orphaned. The 4 orphaned Devlin children parcelled out to bachelor uncles and boarding schools. Margaret Campbell, whose grief at her husband's death was such, the hospital staff strapped her to a mattress. Denise Mullen, who at the age of 4 stood over her dead father's body for nearly an hour, covered in his blood.
When they came to court, the prosecution service had withdrawn the most serious charges. They weren't being charged with attempted murder, even though they had riddled the bar with machine gun fire. They went to court. They came before the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Lowry, who listened to the case and then gave them suspended sentences. And at the end, and it's summing up, I'm only going to take 2 lines from it. In the end, the Lord Chief Justice said that what had been happening in this part of the world required, quote, more than ordinary police work, which was needed and was justified to rid the land of the pestilence which has been in existence. Well, you can agree with him to the extent that it was more than ordinary police work.
Well, bad and all as the British are, the Irish are worse when it comes to releasing documents. Really, the name of our campaign group in Dublin is Justice for the Forgotten, and they have largely been forgotten by the Irish state. The relatives there are, if anything, even further from establishing the truth than relatives in the north. It was, for example, particularly telling that neither the Irish nor the British government thought anything was wrong in inviting Queen Elizabeth to visit Dublin on the anniversary of the Dublin and Monaghan bombings. Now that is adding insult to injury, just symbolic of that total lack of care.
The only time I ever despair is when we can't find information. And I have to say it's a particular issue here in Belfast. There was a lot of killings here in Belfast, a lot of drive-bys, a lot of people walking into a pub at night, opening fire, disappearing. The RUC didn't bother. There was no proper forensics done, there was no investigation done, there was no ballistics done. Where I despair is when a family approach us and we can find nothing. Today would be the opposite of despair. Today I think would be a tremendous uplift, not for us, just for us in the PFC, I think also for Relatives for Justice, for academics, for people from CHA that were here, and for others to say, right, let's get back to the drawing board, let's keep going, let's do more of this work. Because I think today was an uplifting experience. There was hundreds of people packed into this hall on a Saturday afternoon to attend the launch of a book about murders, none of which took place in Belfast. And yet hundreds of people in Belfast turned out.
For families who are the victims of collusion, the legacy is an abiding mistrust of the state, for example. Families who believe for 38 years that they were orphaned by a cheese processor who discovered that the cheese processor was actually an RUC man. Families who lost their mother, and another family who lost a young son in the step-in bombing that could have been prevented by a stroke of a pen or a 30-second phone call because the RUC knew all about it in advance, and the HE report is unambiguous. This bombing could have been prevented. People who lost their lives, and these quite often, they're all uninvolved. There's no paramilitary or political connections of any of these victims, but quite often they were upwardly aspirational, middle class, well, not middle class, but people who had an education, who were confident, who were hoping for a new future, who maybe had bought a house or were renovating a house, started a new business, owned a farm, owned a business, a shop or a pub. And they were that new, burgeoning, new, confident Catholic middle class in the 1970s who wanted their human and constitutional rights. And it was almost as though this was an attempt to make them, to get them to hang their heads and not to demand their rights. It could have been as calculated as that.
Thank you very much. I know I've already done it, but I'm going to do it again, particularly to the families that are here that have travelled far, and the Douglas family are also here from Scotland, who suffered grievously in the early bombings in Dublin in the early 70s. To everybody else that's here, to everyone that's spoken today, and to Danny for helping to organise it, to the Féile who've helped sponsor it, and to all of you. Thank you.